This week, we're looking at polity in the PCA. So polity has to do with church government, organization, how it works, that sort of thing. And then we're going to, I hope, spend most of the time this week talking about our local presbytery, a little bit of the background of it. It's just good to have an awareness of who the brothers are that you're so close to. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But first, a few things about sort of church government in general, and then the PCA in particular. There are essentially three forms of church government. There are lots of variations, just like other things. And you look at the variations, and sometimes it's really hard to separate them because some blend some aspects of different things of that. But essentially, you have sort of the congregational form of church government, the Episcopal form of church government, and the Presbyterian form of church government. Congregational essentially is that there's no real authority. I mean, other than, most congregations recognize the Bible and our Lord Jesus Christ as head of the church, that sort of thing. They don't disagree about those things for the most part, but the congregation is sort of an entity into itself, independent of other churches. They might form associations, but they're rather voluntary associations. And so all the decisions about how the church operates are made within the church. Often the pastor is quite the authority figure. There may or may not be some sort of board that works usually under him, and then the congregation has a bit of say-so in what goes on. So most charismatic churches are congregational. Baptist churches certainly tend to be, even though there's the Southern Baptist group and so on. They form those associations, but again, they're more voluntary even than most others. So the authority is vested in the congregation itself. They don't see scriptural reasons for denominations beyond the congregation. I'll talk briefly about those in just a moment. The Episcopal form is basically characterized by bishops. And so the ultimate authority in the church is not residing in the congregation, but in the bishop. Now, like Roman Catholic Church, of course, is the Episcopal form sort of on steroids, with the Pope and the cardinals and, all of that. But you have a hierarchy where the Pope is the supreme leader, if you will, and then the cardinals and on down to the local priests, bishops over them. Methodist churches and many Lutheran churches are also Episcopal. And so the bishop has a lot of say. I remember many years ago, I had a cousin who went to the Methodist church in Trafford, and they had a pastor they just dearly loved, and the bishop decided it was time for him to move on, and he sent someone else in. The congregation was not happy at all and protested, but there's really nothing they could do. It's the bishop's decision. He can move pastors around at will. And so the congregation has very little say. The bishop has ultimate say in that Episcopal form of church government. Obviously, Episcopalian churches are that too. The word episkopos is the biblical word for bishop. That's where the term comes from. So it's not distinctly of the Episcopal Church or the Episcopalian Church, but Episcopal form of church government is from episkopos, the bishop. So then the third form that we think is the most consistently biblical is Presbyterianism. We look at the scriptures, and it seems that the apostles in writing dealt with multiple elders in each church. And elders, the term elder is presbyteros in Greek, and so we get Presbyterian and presbytery and all those words coming from presbyteros. So it just means an elder, an older man. At some point I'll probably pull out my reading glasses, because that's a sign of what we call presbyopia, which optic, your eyes, and presby, which is old. I have old eyes. Presbyopia sounds much better, but it means old eyes. When you start needing these, that's where you are. So Presbyterian is the rule by elders. We also believe, though, in a connectionalism. You'll find the odd things in all facilities, as I mentioned. There is up toward Butler, for example, that's been connected sort of with the PCA, but not of it. The Independent Presbyterian Church. Now, that to most Presbyterians, that's kind of a contradiction in terms, but such things exist. There's these kind of contradictions. But we believe, for example, I mentioned, if you look at the scriptures, Paul writes to multiple elders in each location, tells Timothy to appoint elders, plural, and so there's multiple elders in each congregation. But where do we get the idea of then congregations joined together? Well, one of the basic, there's a number of ways, but the most basic, the most fundamental is when you look at, again, the letters of the New Testament, when Paul writes to the church in Corinth. There was a church in Corinth, and he writes to that church. When he writes to the church of Ephesus, he writes to Ephesus. But both Corinth and Ephesus, and particularly later Rome, as he writes to the church of Rome, most likely those cities of that size where the church had developed for a while had multiple congregations, but he sees them as one church. Certainly Galatia is that way. When he writes to the Galatians, Galatia is not a city but a region. So he's really writing to the churches of the region of Galatia, and yet he addresses them with a certain unity. And so that's where we get the idea of presbyteries. The churches of an area are bound together with one another and seen as, what the OP has a tendency to call it the regional church. The PCA doesn't generally use that term. It's the same thing. The presbytery is kind of the regional church. But remember, when there was a controversy in the church, early on in the book of Acts, they call together representatives from many churches, together with the apostles and the elders, and they come together in Jerusalem for the Council of Jerusalem and made decisions affecting all the churches, and then send the word out that this is what we have decided for all of you. And so that's where we get the idea, basically, of a general assembly. That we have a general assembly that meets. So you have the level of the congregation and the elders there, the session. Then you have the presbytery, the regional body, and then you have the general assembly that makes decisions for the entire denomination. Now, in the PCA, as I mentioned last week, you have two kinds of officers, elders and deacons. Among the elders, you have the ruling elders and the teaching elders. And among teaching elders, there are some different offices too. There can be, missionaries and professors and those sort of things, but basically they look at three offices in the local church. Not every church has them. Many just have a pastor, or what we call a solo pastor. But you may also have an associate pastor. That's a pastor who is associated, obviously, with the senior pastor, and you can have assistant pastors. Now, what's the difference between an associate pastor and an assistant pastor? When I was called to First Reformed many years ago, I went as an associate pastor. Someone asked me that at Presbytery. And I said, so what's the difference between an assistant pastor and an associate pastor? Being the smart aleck that I am, I said, I believe about $5,000 a year. Usually the associate pastor does make a little more, but the differences really are these. The assistant pastor can be called by the session, and is technically called by the session, usually with congregational approval. But like when Chris is ordained, Lord willing, and if we call him to be an assistant pastor, the session technically executes that call. And he is not, as an assistant pastor, a member of the session, not a voting member of the session. The associate pastor, on the other hand, must be called by the congregation, just as the senior pastor or solo pastor, and is then a voting member of the congregation. And so a little more authority sits with the pastor and the ruling elders on the session. So that's the difference between an associate and an assistant. We have, and the session is sort of the basic, for most members, court of the church. We refer to them as the church courts. And so the lowest court in the Presbyterian Church and the PCA is the church session. And then, of course, the presbytery sits as a court of the church, and ultimately the General Assembly. Decisions work that way. We also have organizations, committees that function within the PCA. Basically, you'll hear all these initials being thrown around. But there's MTW, Mission to the World, that oversees foreign missions. MNA, Mission to North America, that oversees home missions, if you will, domestic missions. There's RUF, the Reformed University Fellowship, which Derek Bates and Callie Miller at Pitt, that we've supported for many years. That's part of RUF, Reformed University Ministries. And then there's an administration committee and a committee of discipleship. It's really Christian Ed and Publications that works together with the OPC. So those are the kind of things. The PCA, as I mentioned, I believe I mentioned last week, started in 1973, came out of the Southern churches that were very disturbed by the drift into liberalism of much of the denomination there, decided that they couldn't reform it from the inside. They really needed to step out and begin a new body. They met in 1973 in Birmingham, Alabama, in a church called Briarwood. It's still a flagship PCA church. Frank Barker was, and I believe still is, the pastor. He may be honorably retired by this time. But anyway, they came together and formed a new church. They called it the National Presbyterian Church, but then very quickly, I believe just one meeting, changed it to the Presbyterian Church in America, the PCA. And so that's really the roots of it. And it spread fairly quickly in the South, got a great rate of growth as churches were leaving and looking for a more reliably biblical, conservative, reformed body to be a part of. And so there was strong growth in that. But a big part of the growth of the PCA really came in 1982. There was a smaller Presbyterian denomination with much deeper roots than the 1973 founded PCA. It was called the Reformed Presbyterian Church Evangelical Synod. Sort of in the convoluted, they sometimes call Presbyterians the split peas because there have been so many divisions. Well, that was part of it. There was a Bible Presbyterian Church that was partly formed in reaction to some things in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. And then the Bible Presbyterian Church divided, and you had the Reformed Presbyterian Church. You have the old Reformed Presbyterian Church, the seminary in Wilkinsburg, which is not a part of that. This was that's why they called it the RPCES. That's the Reformed Presbyterian Church of North America. This was the Reformed Presbyterian Church Evangelical Synod. Anyway, I remember someone from that church saying, we've been an OP, we've been a BP, we've been an RPCES, and what will be this time next year is anybody's guess. Well, what they became in 1982 was the PCA. There was what they called joining and receiving. It's usually referred to as J&R. And so the RPCES joined and was received into the PCA. That's how we got First Reformed was an RPCES congregation, for example. A number of them in our presbytery were formerly RPCES congregations. That's where the PCA picked up both Covenant College and Covenant Seminary. Those were both schools of the RPCES. So with J and R, they became the schools of the PCA, Covenant College, Covenant Seminary. Anyway, the polity of the PCA, I've kind of been walking through some aspects of it, but essentially it's made up of a couple of things. The Book of Church Order and the Westminster Confession of Faith and the Larger and Shorter Catechism. That's what makes up the Constitution, we call it, of the PCA. We believe firmly what the Confession teaches, that the Bible is the only rule of faith and practice, but in seeking to understand, to work out, to spell out how we live together as a church, we follow that confession, those catechisms, and the Book of Church Order. The Book of Church Order has a number of parts. The form of government, which just tells how to how to run your church. How does the church operate? It talks about the officers and how to ordain someone, how to elect officers. All those kind of things are spelled out in the form of government. So that's part of the Constitution. There's also then in there the rules of discipline. So if you should ever have cases against an officer or a member, how is that handled? It's spelled out very carefully in the rules of discipline. And then there's the Directory of Worship. Now the Directory of Worship is not constitutional. So it comes as pious advice. It's guidance on worship, except chapters 56 to 58 have been given constitutional authority. Those deal with the sacraments and membership. And so if we receive a new member, you have to record in the minutes, did they come by transfer from another church? Do they come by profession of faith? Do they come by reaffirmation of faith? Those are all spelled out in that one of those chapters, and that's constitutional. So we have to do that. You can't just make up how you receive members. And of course, baptism and the Lord's Supper are both given constitutional authority. What the Directory for Worship says about those. So anyway, I think enough about that. Yeah. Probably more than you ever wanted to know about the PCA, but there's actually so much more we could talk about. But that gives you an overview, a nice overview, I think, of how the church is organized and how it runs. At least I hope that was coherent and gives you that overview. Let's talk about our presbytery. Our presbytery was sort of forming for some time. Really, it ultimately came together in 1975, the real organization of the Presbytery. Prior to that, names you would know, certainly if you've listened to me at all, names you would know well were sort of part of getting ready for that. There was a group that met in the Pittsburgh Church. At the time, David Williams was instrumental in organizing it. Dr. Gershner was a part of it. R.C. Sproul was a part of it. Carl Bogue from Ohio, and just quite a number of people. And they came together and they were trying to became a group that someone would present a paper, book reviews, prayer together. But essentially the purpose of it was strategizing about how to bring reform to what at the time was the UPC, the United Presbyterian Church, which Pitcairn was a part of. And so the people came together and were like, how could we? Women's ordination was a big issue back then, and I was occasionally at that meeting. But anyway, became a part of it later after the PCA had formed and Pitcairn had joined it. But anyway, what happened? The biggest precipitating event. I mean, there was distress and debate about, can we really do anything? Are we helpless here, or are we hopeful that we can bring reform to the denomination? And sort of the straw that broke the camel's back, as they say, was called the Kenyon case. Happened in 1974. It happened Wynn Kenyon, Walter Wynn Kenyon, Dave Kenyon from Ligonier, my good friend, his older brother. Was a fine man, a brilliant man, a Gershner student through seminary, and he came to be ordained in the United Presbyterian Church. And while those who were pushing, had already pushed through ordination of women as elders and even as pastors, gave all these assurances that we just want the freedom to follow our conscience and ordain people we believe properly should be ordained, but we'll give you your freedom not to if you think that's biblically unwarranted. And so there were supposed to be, fairness on the issue. But by 74, when Wynn Kenyon came for ordination, he was asked, would you ordain a woman? And he said no, that his conscience would not allow him to do that. He believed it was not a biblical thing to do, that the Bible said men only in the role of elders and pastors. He said he would work with women, he would respect the view of others and be happy to work alongside of them, but he could not personally ordain them. And the Presbytery took the position then that then we cannot ordain you. We will not ordain you. There's quite some controversy about that, but it was clear then that sort of our men, the men on our side, the Reformed people were not going to be able to be ordained in that denomination. And that, more than any other single thing, really pushed toward the formation of the PCA here. So it was a new denomination at the time. We're talking at 73 when it was founded. It's only 75 when a group of men came together to form, leave the UPC and come into the PCA. Pitcairn was not one of the original members of that. David was holding back, still hoping for reform. Dr. Gershner stayed in a long time, but anyway, a group decided it was time, and they came together to organize a new presbytery and ask R.C. Sproul to preach a sermon as part of the organizing meeting that they had. R.C. preached. I wasn't there. I didn't hear it, but I've been told it was just it was R.C. At his finest. He preached on the importance of the ascension of Christ, and the Presbytery members that were there were just so moved by this stirring biblical account of the importance of the ascension that they named the Presbytery Ascension Presbytery. And it was the first PCA Presbytery north of the Mason-Dixon line, so the first Northern Presbyterian church presbytery to come together. And it was fairly rare at the time. There was Vanguard Presbytery, one of the first, but by and large, the PCA uses geographical names. The Presbytery of this and that, this area and that area. And so it was different that it was Ascension Presbytery, not given a different name. And you say, well, wait a minute, I thought we were in Pittsburgh Presbytery. Well, we are, because Pitcairn came in and a number of other churches came into the PCA, and so it continued to grow and reached a point where we decided it was just too big. Basically, it went from Cumberland, Maryland, which we still have a church there, to Erie, and it was just hard to travel to Presbytery and so on. It goes over into a sliver of Ohio and out to Johnstown, and so you had this big, large presbytery, and decided that there were sufficient numbers of churches and members that the presbytery could be divided. And so in 1993, the presbytery divided. So Ascension Presbytery is basically north of Pittsburgh Presbytery, has the Cumberland, still has Johnstown, still has East Liverpool, Ohio, and goes as far north as Wexford. And then everything above Wexford up to Erie is now Ascension Presbytery. So we still work closely with them, dear brothers in the Lord, but have separated as two separate and distinct presbyteries since 1993. Pittsburgh Presbytery has, I believe, 22 congregations. Those who have the notes, one just came in and one's going out. So I think that's the number. The South Hills mission work is organized as an independent church, so they're now in the role of churches, not mission works. And as you know, the other Monroeville church, Grace Reformed, is disbanding in a few months, and so we gained one or losing one. But the Presbytery remains strong. I think it's 22 churches, something like that, and there's several mission works, one in Indiana and a few others that are still going. We have the RUF program at Pitt. We also have an RUF missionary, or I guess they call them an RUF worker in Indiana, Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania, the university there. So it's a very active presbytery, very involved, a strong presbytery. Our stated clerk, a guy who keeps it all organized, is Lee Capper from Cumberland, Maryland. Lee's been the stated clerk for a long time, does a wonderful job, just a fantastic job, and is a dear friend also. We've prayed for him and his wife many times, as we should. The Presbytery generally meets 4 times a year. There's 4 stated meetings a year, January, April, July, and October. Those are one-day meetings 4 times a year. There are other called meetings. Sometimes there's some business that needs to be done. Maybe somebody wanting to be ordained in a church, just bringing in a pastor and they want him ordained and installed now. Or so special meetings can be called. Really, with they need, I think, 4 elders from at least 2 different churches, or 3, I forget the figure. It's in the Book of Order, of all places, which has a great index, so I'd have to look it up if I wanted to call a special meeting. But anyway, it's not very hard to do. It's not cumbersome to call a special meeting. So, Grace Reformed, First Reformed, Calvin up in North Huntington. Of course, the Murraysville Church. We support the Jeanette work with Nate Kiesel and so on. So there are a number of churches sort of close by to us, Grace and Peace, down in toward Pittsburgh, the City Reformed down actually in Pittsburgh. And so we have a number of PCA works in this area. It's a very strong area. Sometimes as you move out, they're far more scattered than what we have around here, which I think is a great blessing. Talked about the history of our church last class. We came into the PCA as the merged church, New Covenant, and those of you who were around then remember the obstacles in leaving the OP church for some of us, and it was much easier to come into the PCA than to leave the OP. Theoretically, at least, leaving the PCA, should we decide to do that for whatever reason, is not that hard. Because the PCA came into existence with churches leaving and often with great property battles and so on, it became a founding principle, really, that churches own their own property. They're not held in trust for the denomination as they were in the United Presbyterian Church. Pitcairn had to pay sort of ransom to keep their own building when we came into the PCA, which I'll tell you, maybe I'll finish with one thing about Pitcairn. So if for some reason we decided that it was no longer in our best interest to stay as a part of this denomination, we simply need due notice, then a majority vote of the congregation, and we notify the presbytery and the denomination that we're out, that we've left. So a fairly simple matter, and the property is clearly would belong to the congregation. So anyway, I try to hurry through that to get that all in and keep these a reasonable length. I hope a reasonable length. But the story. So I forget exactly what year it is. I should have looked that up, but I was part of the Presbyterian Church there in Pitcairn. David Williams was still the pastor, dear David Williams. And when we voted to leave the UP and to join the PCA, we looked at some other denominations, decided that the PCA was the best choice, and came into it. But if you ever are down there, I think it's still there. There's a sign at the front of the church, the old sign, that said First United Presbyterian Church. First United Presbyterian Church of Pitcairn. And the first week that we were officially in the PCA, R.C. Sproul came to preach. And R.C. doesn't miss much. And he saw the sign, and what happened is a man in the church, Vernon Lentz, I believe it was, had taken black paint and painted over First United. So it just said Presbyterian Church of Pitcairn, which is where still called that. But R.C. got up and said, well, I see. Welcome to the PCA. He had been in it since the beginning of Ascension Presbytery. He said, so I understand when you become part of the PCA, you're no longer first and you're no longer united. Pointing the sign that many of the people had missed. They didn't even know what he was saying. We learned. But yeah, we were no longer first. We were united and very happy to be in the PCA. And of course, I stayed in the PCA, served at Pitcairn for a couple of years, then First Reformed for 3 years where I was ordained, and then moved to the OP because I was called by covenant. And then after the merger, I'm happily back in the PCA. I do love the PCA, and missed it while I was away, and was very happy to be home. There are a number of guys, like I've mentioned, Dave Kenyon, Lee Capper, that I've known for more than 30 years. There's a number of others in the Presbytery, Dave Carlberg, still at Johnstown, and so on. So it feels like home to me. So anyway, there's a little bit about the PCA in general, Ascension, now Pittsburgh Presbytery in particular. So I hope that's helpful. Thank you.